All right, the next unit, methods in psychology. Now, make sure that you are paying attention to this particular unit because this is the most common place where they will have FRQ questions. And I guarantee there will be an FRQ on this. Okay, realms of psychology. So, psychology has a wide range of specialty areas like clinical counseling and where they do evaluation, diagnosis, and treatment in disorders. So this is something that you want to make sure that you're aware of. And in forensic psychology, you have jury selection and profiling, while in educational psychology, they usually focus on learning methods and materials in those aspects. And then in industrial and organizational psychology, they have workplace dynamics, which include employee satisfaction and motivation. This is also where you make the most money. So this is the field where you make the most money. So one thing to remember is the difference in psychology and psychiatry. So psychiatry requires a medical degree. So they are the ones who are called a doctor. And they can prescribe medication. So they can prescribe medication while a psychologist is not labeled as a doctor and they cannot prescribe medication. A psychologist mostly focuses on observational methods of study and therapy. Empiricism. So, empiricism is the view that knowledge originates in experience, and science should therefore rely on observation and experimentation. So, it's just that ideology that whatever you learn originates from, your experiences and experimentation and what you observed. And another thing to keep in mind is that there are hundreds of approaches, theories, and ideas that encompass the study in behavior. Thus, everything in psychology must be researched thoroughly because psychology looks at so many different aspects, so it has to be thoroughly researched. Research. So you have applied research, which has clear practical applications, and psychologists conduct research in order to solve practical problems. That's where the term applied comes from. It's solving something practical. How can you apply the knowledge you gain from this research in, daily problems? Psychologists might compare two different methods of teaching children to read in order to determine which method is better. That's an example of applied research from the Barron's textbook. I'll be gathering a lot of examples from that. You don't have to copy that down, but make sure you're listening because Barron's actually gives a lot of good examples. And you also have basic research, which explores questions that are of interest to psychologists, but are not intended to have immediate real-world applications. So this is something that it really has no use to us, but in the world of psychology, it's kind of included. So an example would be studying how people form their attitudes about others and how people in different cultures define intelligence. Like no one's really going to care, how people form their attitudes about others as much unless of course you're doing this for a psychology-based research. Experiment. A carefully controlled method of investigation used to establish a cause and effect relationship. So that's what an experiment is. When you think of experiment, think of cause and effect. And the stuff on this slide are definitely something you need to keep in mind because this is a common place for FRQs. So, aspects of an experiment. You obviously have an hypothesis, which expresses a relationship between two or more variables. In other words, a testable statement. So you're making a statement about something that's testable. And a variable is something that can vary among the participants in the research. So it can be religion, stress level, or height. These are things that can vary among participants in a research. And within variables, you have dependent variable, which is a factor measured by the experimenter dependent on the independent variable. So this is something that can be measured. When you think of dependent, you should think of something that's resulting from the independent variable, and it's something that can be measured. And the independent variable is something that can be manipulated by the experimenter. And sometimes the independent variable is also known as the manipulated variable. So research aims to gather data that either supports or disproves a hypothesis. And that is the main purpose of a hypothesis, to see if something is testable or not. And hypotheses hypotheses often grow out of theories, and it aims to explain some kind of phenomenon and allows researchers to generate testable hypotheses with the hope of collecting data that support the theory. Operational definitions. Know this. Know this. FRQ, FRQ, know this. Operational definitions are a precise description of how the variable in a study will be manipulated and measured. So they really want to know, how are you going to do all this stuff? So it raises many issues about the validity and reliability of the research as well. So an example would be how do video games create violent behavior? So in this case, the operational definition for the independent variable would be what video games are considered violent. So you might need to include the types of violent video games and how will the frequency of play be measured. So hours, days, ect, and etc. And then operational definition for the dependent variable would be what is violent behavior, what actions will be counted as proof for violent behavior so that you're able to measure it. Like, is someone punching a wall considered violent behavior? Things like that. Validity and reliability. Valid research measures what the researcher set out to measure, and it is accurate. So it measures what the researcher wanted to measure in the first place. And reliable research, it can be replicated, and it is consistent. So these are things when you're conducting the research, you have to make sure that it's valid and it's reliable. So, valid, it's you're able to measure what you wanted to measure, and reliable, it can be, done again, and it's consistent. And remember, if the researcher conducted the same research in the same way, the researcher would get similar results. That's basically what we're trying to do here. Sampling. Another thing you want to remember for the FRQ. Participants or subjects, these are the individuals on which the research will be conducted. And sampling itself is the process by which participants are selected. So it's the process. And the population includes anyone and anything that could possibly be selected to be in the sample. So, for example, if you wanted to look at the video game example again, your population would probably be, teens maybe. Teens is a good population. And then from that population, you would have to select your participants or your subjects from that population of teens. So maybe a population from like a nearby high school or something. In order to select a sample, one must first identify the population. And, we thought of maybe a local high school, that population from there. The goal in selecting a sample is that it must be representative of a larger population. So in this case, the example with maybe selecting kids from a local high school, they're representing all the kids in high school in the entire nation or world maybe. If asked on the advanced placement examination to design your own research, you should specify the size of your sample and avoid using samples of extreme size. This is another tip for when writing an FRQ on something like this. Make sure to specify the size of your sample. And if I conduct my research about television violence using only my own psychology students, I cannot say much about how viewing violent television affects other people. So that's kind of talking about the entire aspect of how you need to make sure that your sample represents a larger population. Because if you're using only psychology students, then it's not really going to represent students in general. So that's one thing to consider. Extraneous variables. Another thing you want to keep in mind for FRQs. Control group. This is something that consists of similar subjects who do not receive the special treatment given to the experimental group. So they're kind of the group that just stays the same. And it serves as a basis mostly for comparison. And the experimental group consists of subjects that do receive special treatment in regards to the independent variable. So once again, with the video game example, the experimental group would be the kids playing the video game, while the control group would be the kids not playing the video game. And the control group is there just to see, after the kids in the experimental group play their video game, are, these two different groups, are they still aggressive at the same level, or is the experimental group more aggressive? So it's just there for comparison. Stratified sampling. This is a process that allows a researcher to ensure that the sample represents the population on some kind of criteria, and this can increase the likelihood that a sample will represent the larger population from which it was chosen. So to explain this, here's an example from the Barron's book. For instance, if I thought that participants of different racial groups might respond differently, I would want to make sure that I represent each race in my sample in the same proportion that it appeared in the overall population. So you're basically making sure that you're following a certain type of criteria and, putting it in according to a certain proportion, maybe. So, if you're the racial group example, you need to see how each different racial group reacts according to the number of racial groups in the world. So that's how it works. Randomizing. An example is, I would be better off specifying a larger and more diverse population, the whole student body of 1,000, for example, and then randomly selecting a sample of 100. So random selection is basically where every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Let me stress that word equal. They have an equal chance. And it increases the likelihood that the sample represents the population and that one can generalize the findings to the larger population. So randomizing is totally unbiased, and it really helps represent the overall population instead of conforming it towards maybe a certain group. And random selection is best done using a computer, a table of random numbers, or the tried and true method of picking names out of a hat. So random does not mean, you go ahead and just randomly choose people. It does not work that way. It does not work according to the human mind. It works best on a computer because a computer has no emotions and no bias whatsoever. A computer is just going to choose in random order, just like that. But we as humans, we might, choose something that indirectly, is something more familiar with us. Like, for example, if you were randomly choosing kids to take a survey, you would probably approach the person that you knew better or was in your class versus some random kid you don't even know. So that's why it's better to use a computer or, just pull it out of a hat or something, like do events that are just independent and have no other cause to them. Types of research. So you have the experimental research, which is a research method in which the investigator manipulates a variable under carefully controlled conditions and observes whether any changes occur in a second variable as a result. So in experimental research, you're really manipulating variables, and it's in a carefully controlled environment, and you're really looking at the cause and effect factor of it. While in the descriptive or correlational research, this is a research method in which an investigator cannot manipulate variables, so there is no manipulation of variables happening, and it's meant to describe patterns of behaviors or links between variables. So they are trying to find a relationship between variables, but the main difference between experimental and descriptive / correlational research is that in experimental, you are really controlling your conditions and variables, while in descriptive and correlational, you have to find a relationship without controlling any of those aspects. Now, I will pause here and then see you in part 2.